Sergeant Elias Morgan had been standing guard at Windsor Castle for 3 years, and he thought he had seen and heard everything there was to know about royal life. The 28-year-old from Wales had worked his way up through the ranks to become one of the most trusted guards in the Queen's personal protection detail, a position that required absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty. His daily routine involved long hours of standing at attention, escorting royal family members through their private quarters, and maintaining security during private meetings and family gatherings. On this particular Tuesday evening in October, Elias was assigned to guard duty outside the Queen's private study in the east wing of Windsor Castle. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the ancient windows as he stood at his post, listening to the familiar sounds of the castle settling into evening quiet. The corridors were dimly lit by traditional wall sconces, creating shadows that danced across the stone walls and reminded Elias of the centuries of history that surrounded him. Every day the Queen had been in meetings all afternoon, with various government officials and palace advisors, discussing matters that were far above Elias's pay grade and security clearance. As a guard, he was trained to be invisible and deaf to conversations that weren't meant for his ears, maintaining his position while mentally filtering out the political discussions and family conversations that occurred around him daily. Around 8:30 in the evening, Elias heard footsteps approaching from the main corridor. He recognized the sound immediately as belonging to Prince Andrew, who was walking briskly toward the Queen's study with what appeared to be urgent business. The prince knocked briefly on the heavy oak door before entering without waiting for a response, something that indicated the serious nature of his visit. The study door was thick and heavy, designed to muffle sound and provide privacy for sensitive discussions. However, Elias's position directly outside the door meant that raised voices or emotional conversations could sometimes be heard. Despite the royal family's attempts at discretion, he had learned over the years to mentally block out these overheard fragments, understanding that his job required him to protect not just the family's physical safety but their privacy as well. What happened next would challenge every principle of loyalty and discretion that had been drilled into Elias during his years of service. The conversation inside the study began quietly, with the familiar murmur of voices that typically accompanied family discussions. However, within minutes, the tone became more heated and the voices more distinct, making it impossible for Elias to avoid hearing what was being said. Prince Andrew's voice rose first, filled with frustration and what sounded like desperation. He was discussing financial problems that went far beyond the typical concerns of royal budgeting or charitable obligations. Elias heard references to debts, legal troubles, and payments that had been made to individuals whose names he didn't recognize but whose involvement, it seemed, to cause significant distress to both the prince and the Queen. The Queen's response was sharp and angry, expressing disappointment and concern about the potential consequences of Andrew's actions. She spoke about damage to the monarchy's reputation, the need for secrecy, and the lengths to which the palace had already gone to protect Andrew from public scrutiny and legal consequences. Her words painted a picture of a family crisis that had been carefully hidden from the British public and media. As the conversation continued, Elias began to understand that he was overhearing details about a scandal involving Prince Andrew that went far beyond anything that had been reported in the newspapers. The discussion revealed payments that had been made to silence accusers, evidence that had been destroyed or hidden, and a systematic cover-up that involved multiple members of the royal household and government officials. The most shocking revelation came when the Queen explicitly discussed using taxpayer money and royal funds to pay for Andrew's legal defense and settlements with accusers. She spoke about manipulating media coverage, pressuring journalists to kill stories, and using royal influence to protect Andrew from criminal prosecution. The conversation revealed a level of corruption and abuse of power that contradicted everything Elias had believed about the royal family's integrity and respect for the law. Elias felt his hands begin to shake as the full implications of what he was hearing began to sink in. He had dedicated his career to protecting and serving a family that he had believed represented the best of British values and traditions. The conversation he was overhearing revealed that the royal family was willing to use their position and public resources to cover up serious crimes and protect one of their own from facing justice. The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with both the Queen and Prince Andrew detailing the extensive measures they had taken to suppress evidence and silence witnesses. They spoke about specific individuals who had been paid substantial sums to withdraw complaints or refuse to cooperate with law enforcement. The conversation revealed a network of lawyers, media contacts, and government officials who were actively working to protect Prince Andrew from the consequences of his actions. As Elias listened to the devastating details of the cover-up, he struggled with the growing realization that his oath of loyalty to the royal family was now in direct conflict with his moral obligations as a citizen and human being. The family he had sworn to protect was using their power and influence to obstruct justice and prevent victims from seeking accountability for serious crimes. The conversation finally ended when Prince Andrew left the study, walking past Elias without making eye contact. The prince's face was flushed and his hands were visibly trembling, suggesting that even he was disturbed by the extent of the measures being taken to protect him. The Queen remained in her study, and Elias could hear her making phone calls to individuals whose names he recognized as prominent lawyers and media executives. As Elias stood at his post for the remaining hours of his shift, his mind raced with the implications of what he had learned. He thought about his own family back in Wales. Honest working-class people who had raised him to respect authority but also to stand up for what was right. He thought about the victims whose voices were being silenced by royal money and influence, and about the British taxpayers who were unknowingly funding a massive cover-up operation. The night seemed to stretch endlessly as Elias grappled with the most difficult decision of his life. His training in military discipline told him to remain silent, to treat what he had heard as classified information that was not his responsibility to act upon. However, his conscience and sense of justice demanded that he find a way to expose the truth and ensure that justice was served, regardless of the personal consequences he might face. When his shift ended at 6 in the morning, Elias walked slowly back to his quarters, knowing that his life had been fundamentally changed by what he had overheard. He was no longer just a royal guard following orders and protecting the family he served. He had become a witness to serious crimes and a systematic abuse of power, and he faced a choice that would define not only his own future but potentially the future of the British monarchy itself. As he lay in his narrow bed in the guards' quarters, staring at the ceiling and listening to his colleagues preparing for their own shifts, Elias knew that he could never go back to the simple loyalty and unquestioning service that had characterized his career up to this point. The shocking secret he had learned would either destroy his life or give it a meaning and purpose that he had never imagined possible. Elias Morgan barely slept during the 24 hours following his devastating discovery. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the Queen's voice discussing the systematic cover-up that was protecting Prince Andrew from facing justice for his crimes. The weight of the knowledge sat on his chest like a stone, making it difficult to breathe and impossible to focus on his normal duties as a royal guard. The next day brought a new shift assignment, and Elias found himself standing guard during a routine morning meeting between the Queen and her private secretary. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal after what he had learned the night before. Palace staff moved through the corridors with their usual efficiency. Tourists gathered outside the castle gates to catch glimpses of royal life, and his fellow guards performed their duties with the same dedication and loyalty that had once defined his own service. But everything had changed. For Elias, he now saw the opulent surroundings of Windsor Castle not as symbols of British tradition and heritage, but as evidence of the wealth and power being used to obstruct justice and silence victims. Every royal portrait seemed to mock him with its representation of honor and duty, values that were being systematically betrayed by the very people he had sworn to protect during his lunch break. Elias retreated to a quiet corner of the guards' mess hall and tried to think through his options rationally. The easiest course of action would be to remain silent and pretend he had never heard the conversation between the Queen and Prince Andrew. He could continue his career as a royal guard, eventually retire with a modest pension, and never have to face the consequences of challenging the most powerful family in Britain. However, Elias couldn't stop thinking about the victims whose suffering was being ignored and whose voices were being silenced by royal money and influence. The conversation he had overheard had made it clear that multiple women had made credible accusations against Prince Andrew, and that these accusations were being systematically suppressed through payments, legal maneuvering, and media manipulation. The moral weight of his knowledge was crushing. Elias had been raised in a working-class family in Cardiff where honesty and integrity were fundamental values. His father had worked in the coal mines for 30 years, and his mother had been a primary school teacher who instilled in him a deep respect for justice and fairness. The idea of remaining silent while serious crimes were being covered up went against everything his parents had taught him about right and wrong. Elias considered approaching his immediate superior, Captain Richards, who had been a mentor and friend during his years of service. However, he quickly realized that Richards was part of the same system that was protecting the royal family from accountability. Any report he made through official channels would likely be suppressed or ignored, and he would probably find himself transferred to a remote posting or dismissed from service entirely. The option of going to the police also seemed futile, given what he had heard about government officials being involved in the cover-up. The conversation between the Queen and Prince Andrew had made it clear that high-ranking members of law enforcement were actively working to protect the royal family from investigation and prosecution. Elias had no confidence that a report to local authorities would result in any meaningful action. As the days passed, Elias found it increasingly difficult to perform his duties with the same dedication and enthusiasm that had once characterized his service. He struggled to maintain his composure during ceremonial events, knowing that the pomp and pageantry were masking a darker reality of corruption and abuse of power. His fellow guards began to notice his distraction and moodiness, though none suspected the true cause of his changed behavior. The psychological toll of carrying such devastating knowledge began to affect every aspect of Elias's life. He lost his appetite and had difficulty sleeping, often lying awake at night replaying the conversation he had overheard and wrestling with the implications of what he should do. His relationship with his girlfriend Emma, a nurse from London, began to suffer as he became increasingly withdrawn and unable to explain his obvious distress. Emma noticed the dramatic change in Elias's personality and repeatedly asked him what was wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to share the burden of what he had learned. The oath of secrecy he had taken as a royal guard conflicted with his desire to confide in someone he trusted, creating an additional layer of isolation and stress that threatened to overwhelm him entirely. 2 weeks after overhearing the conversation, Elias made a decision that would change his life forever. Rather than reporting what he had learned through official channels or remaining silent, he decided to take a bold and unprecedented action that would ensure the truth could not be suppressed or ignored. He would document everything he had heard and find a way to make the information public, regardless of the personal consequences he would face. The plan Elias developed was both simple and dangerous. He would use his position as a trusted guard to gather additional evidence of the cover-up, documenting conversations and activities that supported what he had already learned. He would then compile this evidence into a comprehensive report that could be released to multiple media outlets simultaneously, making it impossible for the royal family to suppress or discredit his accusations. Elias understood that this course of action would almost certainly end his career and could result in serious legal consequences, including charges of treason or violating the Official Secrets Act. However, he had reached a point where remaining silent felt like a betrayal of his own values and a participation in the injustice being perpetrated against Prince Andrew's victims. The first step in Elias's plan was to begin keeping detailed notes of everything he observed and overheard during his duties at Windsor Castle. He purchased a small notebook that he could conceal in his uniform and began recording dates, times, and details of conversations and activities related to the ongoing cover-up. The act of documenting what he was witnessing provided some relief from the psychological pressure he had been experiencing, giving him a sense of purpose and direction. Elias also began researching investigative journalists and media outlets that had a history of exposing government corruption and holding powerful figures accountable for their actions. He studied the careers of reporters who had broken major scandals involving politicians and celebrities, looking for individuals who had the courage and resources to take on the British royal family. The most challenging aspect of Elias's plan was maintaining his composure and performance as a royal guard while secretly documenting evidence that could bring down the monarchy. He had to continue standing at attention during royal events, escorting family members through their daily activities, and maintaining the absolute loyalty and discretion expected of his position, all while gathering evidence that would expose their crimes. As Elias prepared to implement his dangerous plan, he wrote a series of letters to his family members, explaining his actions and the reasons behind them. He wanted his parents and siblings to understand that his decision to expose the royal family's crimes was motivated by his commitment to justice and integrity, not by any desire for fame or financial gain. These letters, which he sealed and planned to mail only if his plan was discovered, served as both an explanation and a final goodbye to the life he had known. The weight of his decision to become a whistleblower was enormous, but Elias found strength in the knowledge that he was finally taking action to address the injustice he had witnessed. For the first time since overhearing the conversation between the Queen and Prince Andrew, he felt a sense of purpose and hoped that the truth might eventually be revealed and justice served for the victims whose voices had been silenced by royal power and influence. 3 weeks into his secret documentation project, Elias Morgan had gathered enough evidence to support the shocking conversation he had overheard between the Queen and Prince Andrew. His small notebook contained detailed records of suspicious meetings, unusual financial transactions, and coded conversations that all pointed to an ongoing cover-up operation designed to protect the prince from criminal prosecution and public accountability. The breakthrough moment came when Elias was assigned to guard duty during a late-night meeting between the Queen's private secretary and a prominent London solicitor who specialized in media law and crisis management. The conversation, which took place in the Queen's private dining room, revealed specific details about payments made to journalists and editors to suppress stories about Prince Andrew's activities. Elias carefully noted names, dates, and amounts, building a comprehensive picture of the corruption that extended far beyond the royal family itself. However, as Elias continued to gather evidence, he realized that simply compiling a report and sending it to journalists might not be enough to ensure the truth was revealed. The conversation he had documented showed that the royal family had extensive influence over British media outlets and could potentially suppress or discredit any allegations that emerged from traditional whisper channels. The plan that Elias developed was unprecedented in its boldness and creativity. Rather than trying to work within existing systems or channels that could be controlled or manipulated by royal influence, he decided to take his evidence directly to the British people in a way that could not be ignored, suppressed, or discredited by the palace's media manipulation apparatus. Elias's plan involved using the changing of the guard ceremony, one of the most watched and photographed events in Britain, as a platform to reveal the evidence he had gathered about the royal family's crimes and cover-up activities. During the ceremony, when thousands of tourists and multiple television cameras would be focused on the gods, Elias planned to break protocol in a dramatic way that would ensure maximum attention and make it impossible for the palace to suppress his message. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. No royal god had ever used a ceremonial duty to make a political statement or expose wrongdoing by the royal family. The changing of the gods ceremony was a sacred tradition that represented centuries of loyalty and service, and Elias's plan to disrupt it would be seen as the ultimate betrayal by his colleagues and superiors. Elias spent days preparing for his dramatic revelation, carefully timing his actions to maximize their impact and ensure that his evidence would be seen and recorded by as many people as possible. He created multiple copies of his documentation, concealing them in various locations where they could be retrieved by journalists and investigators even if he was immediately arrested and his primary evidence was confiscated. The night before the ceremony, Elias barely slept as he mentally rehearsed every aspect of his plan. He knew that once he took action, there would be no turning back. His career as a royal god would be over, his reputation would be destroyed, and he would face serious criminal charges that could result in years in prison. However, he also knew that remaining silent would make him complicit in the ongoing cover-up and betrayal of justice. On the morning of November 15th, Elias put on his ceremonial uniform for what he knew would be the last time. The red tunic with its gold braiding, the polished buttons, and the iconic bearskin hat that had once filled him with pride now felt like a costume worn by an actor in a play about honor and duty that had been revealed to be nothing more than elaborate fiction. Elias took his position for the changing of the guard ceremony. He could see the familiar crowd of tourists gathering with their cameras and phones, eager to witness one of Britain's most famous traditions. Television crews from multiple international news networks were positioned around the ceremony area, preparing to broadcast the event to millions of viewers around the world. The ceremony began as it had thousands of times before, with the guards marching in perfect formation and executing the precise movements that had been refined over centuries of tradition. Elias participated in the early stages of the ceremony normally, maintaining the discipline and precision that had been drilled into him during his years of training and service. At exactly 11:47 a.m., during the moment when the guards traditionally stood at attention while the old guard was relieved by the new guard, Elias broke formation in a way that immediately captured the attention of everyone present. Instead of remaining motionless, he stepped forward from the ranks and began to speak in a clear, loud voice that carried across the courtyard and was picked up by the television microphones. "Citizens of Britain and the world," Elias announced, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "I am Sergeant Elias Morgan of the Queen's Guard, and I have evidence of serious crimes being committed and covered up by the royal family. Prince Andrew has been protected from criminal prosecution through the systematic use of royal money and influence to silence his victims and obstruct justice." The reaction was immediate and electric. The crowd of tourists stopped taking photos and began recording Elias's statement with their phones, while the television cameras that had been focused on the ceremonial proceedings suddenly zoomed in on the guard who was making these explosive accusations. The other guards in the formation remained at attention, their training preventing them from reacting to the unprecedented breach of protocol occurring beside them. Elias continued his statement, pulling out copies of his documentation and holding them up for the cameras to record. "I have detailed evidence of payments made to silence accusers, evidence destroyed to protect Prince Andrew, and the use of taxpayer money to fund a massive cover-up operation. This corruption goes to the very heart of the monarchy and involves government officials who have betrayed their oaths to serve justice." Palace security officers began moving toward Elias, but their approach was cautious and measured, as they realized that any attempt to forcibly silence him would only add credibility to his accusations and create additional international media attention. The ceremony had effectively stopped, with tourists and media representatives focusing entirely on the dramatic whistleblowing event unfolding before them. As security personnel surrounded him, Elias threw multiple copies of his evidence documentation into the crowd of tourists and journalists, ensuring that his findings would be preserved and distributed even if he was immediately arrested. The documents scattered across the courtyard, with dozens of people scrambling to collect them and photograph their contents. The British people deserve to know the truth about how their money is being used to protect criminals, Elias declared as palace security officers finally moved to detain him. "Justice cannot be bought or suppressed, no matter how much power and wealth is used to hide the truth. I am willing to face the consequences of speaking out because remaining silent would make me complicit in these crimes." The arrest of Elias was captured by hundreds of cameras and phones, with the dramatic scene being live-streamed and shared across social media platforms within minutes. The guard who had dedicated his career to protecting the royal family was now being forcibly removed from the ceremony for exposing their crimes, creating a powerful visual symbol that would be remembered long after the specific details of his accusations were forgotten. As Elias was led away in handcuffs, he could see tourists and journalists examining the documents he had thrown into the crowd. their faces showing shock and amazement at the detailed evidence of royal corruption and cover-up activities. International news crews were already breaking into their regular programming to report on the unprecedented the event that had just occurred at one of Britain's most sacred ceremonies. The bold gambit had succeeded beyond Ilias's most optimistic expectations. His evidence was now in the hands of journalists and citizens around the world, making it impossible for the royal family to suppress or discredit his accusations through their usual channels of influence and media manipulation. The truth about Prince Andrew's crimes and the systematic cover-up protecting him was finally beginning to emerge into the light, regardless of the personal cost that Elias would now have to pay for his courage and integrity. Within hours of Elias Morgan's dramatic revelation during the changing of the guard ceremony, the story had exploded across international media platforms with an intensity that caught even the most experienced palace crisis managers completely off guard. The combination of compelling evidence, a trusted insider's testimony, and the unprecedented nature of the whistle method created a media firestorm that could not be contained or controlled through traditional royal influence channels. The first major news outlet to break the story was BBC News, whose cameras had been broadcasting the ceremony live when Elias made his shocking announcement. Within 30 minutes of the incident, the network had assembled a team of investigative journalists to examine the documents that had been thrown into the crowd, and their preliminary analysis confirmed that the evidence appeared to be authentic and extremely damaging to the royal family's reputation. International news organizations quickly picked up the story, with CNN, Sky News, and major European broadcasters all leading their evening programs with coverage of the royal guard's explosive accusations. The visual drama of a uniformed guard breaking centuries of protocol to expose royal crimes created compelling television that drew massive audiences and generated millions of social media interactions. Within the first few hours, the initial response was swift but ultimately ineffective in containing the growing scandal. A brief statement from Buckingham Palace dismissed Ilias's accusations as the confused ramblings of a disturbed individual and suggested that he had been suffering from mental health issues that had affected his judgment and perception of events. However, this strategy backfired when journalists began examining the detailed evidence Elias had provided and found that it corroborated many previously unconfirmed rumors about Prince Andrew's activities and legal troubles. Public reaction to Elias's revelations was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive of his courage in speaking out against royal corruption. Social media platforms were flooded with messages praising his integrity and calling for thorough investigations into the allegations he had made. The hashtag royal cover-up began trending worldwide within hours of the incident, with millions of users sharing information about the case and expressing outrage at the abuse of power that Elias had exposed. However, the aftermath also brought severe consequences for Elias himself, who was being held at a London police station on charges of violating the Official Secrets Act, breach of trust, and conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline. The authorities had moved quickly to arrest him and prevent any further disclosures, but the damage to the royal family's reputation had already been done. Through his dramatic public revelation, the legal implications for Elias were serious and potentially life-changing. Government prosecutors were preparing charges that could result in a prison sentence of up to 14 years, and palace officials were reportedly pushing for the maximum penalties available under British law. The message being sent was clear. Whistleblowers who exposed royal crimes would face the full force of the legal system, regardless of the validity or importance of their revelations. Emma, Elias's girlfriend, found herself at the center of a media storm as journalists sought interviews with anyone who knew the whistleblowing guard personally. She was approached by dozens of reporters offering substantial sums for exclusive interviews about Ilias's character and motivations, but she consistently refused to speak publicly about their relationship or his decision to expose the royal family's crimes. The royal family's reputation suffered immediate and severe damage as news organizations around the world began investigating the specific allegations that Elias had made in his documentation. Several prominent newspapers assigned teams of investigative reporters to examine the evidence and seek corroborating sources who could confirm or expand upon the whistleblower's claims about cover-up activities and victim silencing. Prince Andrew himself went into complete seclusion following Elias's revelations, cancelling all public appearances and refusing to respond to media requests for comment on the specific accusations that had been made against him. Palace sources suggested that the prince was consulting with legal advisors about potential defamation actions against media outlets that reported on the whistleblower's evidence, but no formal legal actions were announced. The Queen's own reputation was significantly damaged by the revelations about her direct involvement in protecting Prince Andrew from accountability for his alleged crimes. Public opinion polls conducted in the days following Elias's dramatic disclosure showed a sharp decline in support for the monarchy, with many Britons expressing shock and disappointment at the evidence of royal involvement in obstruction of justice and victim silencing. International reaction to the scandal was swift and severe, with several foreign governments quietly reviewing their diplomatic relationships with Britain and expressing concerns about the rule of law and accountability within the British system. The scandal threatened to undermine Britain's soft power and international reputation at a time when the country was seeking to strengthen its global relationships. Following Brexit, the parliamentary response to Elias's revelations was initially muted, with most members of Parliament adopting a wait-and-see approach while investigators examined the evidence he had provided. However, several opposition politicians began calling for parliamentary inquiries into the allegations and demanding that government officials explain their role in any cover-up activities that may have occurred. The impact on other members of the royal family was significant, with several younger royals reportedly expressing private support for Elias's decision to expose the truth about corruption within their family. Prince William and Prince Harry were said to be particularly concerned about the damage to the monarchy's reputation and the implications for their own future roles within the institution. Media analysis of the evidence Elias had provided began to reveal the sophisticated nature of the cover-up operation that had been protecting Prince Andrew from accountability. Financial experts who examined the documentation found evidence of complex money transfers and legal arrangements designed to conceal payments to accusers and their representatives, suggesting a level of planning and coordination that went far beyond simple damage control. The psychological pressure on Elias during his detention was intense, with palace representatives and government officials reportedly attempting to pressure him into recanting his statements and admitting that his evidence had been fabricated or misunderstood. However, Elias remained steadfast in his commitment to the truth and refused all offers of leniency in exchange for withdrawing his accusations. Public support for Elias, who grew stronger as more details emerged about the evidence he had provided and the personal risks he had taken to expose the truth. Crowdfunding campaigns were established to help pay for his legal defense, and prominent civil rights organizations began offering their support and resources to ensure that he received fair treatment within the justice system. The impact on the Royal Protection Unit was severe, with several high-ranking officers facing internal investigations about their knowledge of the cover-up activities that Elias had documented. The breach of security and protocol represented by his whistleblowing raised serious questions about the loyalty and reliability of the guard system that protected the royal family from external threats. International human rights organizations began examining the case as a potential example of government retaliation against whistleblowers who expose official wrongdoing. The severe charges being brought against Elias was seen by many observers as disproportionate to his actions and designed primarily to deter future disclosures rather than serve legitimate justice interests. The evidence that Elias had provided 6 months after Elias Morgan's dramatic revelation at Windsor Castle. The full scope and impact of his whistleblowing had fundamentally transformed the British monarchy in its relationship with the public. The evidence he had provided during that unprecedented moment had triggered the largest investigation into royal misconduct in modern British history, with consequences that extended far beyond what anyone could have predicted when he first decided to break his oath of silence. The criminal investigation sparked by Elias' evidence had expanded to include over 40 individuals, ranging from palace staff and government officials to journalists and lawyers who had participated in the systematic cover-up of Prince Andrew's alleged crimes. The Metropolitan Police had established a dedicated task force with more than 60 detectives working full-time to unravel the complex web of corruption and obstruction of justice that Elias's documentation had exposed. The most significant breakthrough came when investigators discovered additional evidence in palace files that corroborated every major allegation Elias had made in his original disclosure. Financial records showed payments totaling over £12 million that had been made to silence accusers and their legal representatives, while communications between palace officials and media executives revealed a sophisticated propaganda operation designed to discredit victims and suppress negative stories about Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew himself had been formally charged with multiple counts of sexual assault and conspiracy to obstruct justice, becoming the first senior member of the royal family to face criminal prosecution in over 2 centuries. The prince's legal team had initially attempted to claim diplomatic immunity, but this strategy was abandoned when it became clear that the evidence against him was overwhelming and that public opinion would not tolerate such obvious attempts to avoid accountability. Queen's role in the cover-up had been thoroughly documented through the evidence Elias provided, leading to unprecedented public calls for her abdication and the establishment of a republican form of government. Opinion polls showed that support for the monarchy had fallen to its lowest level in recorded history, with over 60% of Britons expressing the belief that the royal family should be stripped of their official roles and taxpayer funding. Elias's legal battle had become a cause célèbre for civil rights organizations around the world, with prominent lawyers and human rights activists arguing that his prosecution represented government retaliation against a whistleblower who had exposed serious crimes. The case had drawn international attention to Britain's archaic laws regarding royal secrecy and the need for stronger protections for individuals who expose official wrongdoing, the trial of Elias Morgan became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in British history, with international media providing daily coverage of testimony that revealed additional details about the extent of royal corruption and abuse of power. Elias's defense team, led by prominent human rights lawyer Helena Morrison, argued that his actions were not only legally justified under whistleblower protection laws but morally essential given the serious crimes he had witnessed. The prosecution's case against Elias was severely undermined by the mounting evidence that his accusations had been completely accurate and that his disclosure had served the vital public interest of exposing systematic obstruction of justice. Government prosecutors found themselves in the uncomfortable position of arguing that protecting royal criminals was more important than ensuring accountability and justice. For victims of serious crimes, public support for Elias, who had grown stronger throughout his legal ordeal, with massive demonstrations outside the courthouse and petition campaigns that drew millions of signatures, calling for charges against him to be dropped. The contrast between the government's harsh treatment of the whistleblower and their initial protection of the royal criminals he had exposed created a powerful narrative about justice and accountability that resonated with people around the world. The international implications of the scandal were severe and long, with several Commonwealth countries beginning formal processes to remove the British monarch as their head of state. The evidence of royal corruption and abuse of power had shattered the carefully cultivated image of the monarchy as a symbol of integrity and service, making it impossible for many former colonies to maintain their constitutional ties to an institution that had been revealed to be fundamentally corrupt. The impact on British democracy was profound, with the scandal triggering broader conversations about transparency, accountability, and the rule of law that extended far beyond the royal family itself. The revelation that government officials had been complicit in covering up serious crimes raised questions about the integrity of British institutions and the need for fundamental reforms to prevent future abuses of power. The financial investigation revealed that the cover-up operation had been funded not only by royal family resources but also by taxpayer money that had been diverted from official palace budgets. The sovereign grant, which was supposed to fund legitimate royal duties and maintain historic properties, had been systematically abused to pay for legal fees, settlements, and media manipulation designed to protect Prince Andrew from accountability. Parliamentary committees launched comprehensive investigations into government complicity in the cover-up, with several senior civil servants and political advisers being called to testify about their knowledge of and participation in the systematic obstruction of justice. The testimony revealed a culture of deference to royal wishes that had allowed serious crimes to be ignored and covered up for years. The media landscape was permanently altered by the scandal, with several prominent journalists and editors facing criminal charges for their participation in suppressing stories about Prince Andrew's alleged crimes. The revelation that major news organizations had been compromised by royal influence sparked a broader reckoning about press independence and the need for stronger ethical standards in journalism. Elias's family had initially struggled with the public attention and controversy surrounding his decision to become a whistleblower, but they eventually became some of his strongest supporters as the truth of his allegations became undeniable. His parents spoke publicly about their pride in their son's courage and integrity, describing how his upbringing had prepared him to choose justice over personal safety when faced with evidence of serious wrongdoing. The international human rights community embraced Elias as a symbol of courage and integrity in the face of institutional corruption and abuse of power. His case was cited in United Nations reports about the importance of protecting whistleblowers and ensuring accountability for government officials who abuse their positions to commit or cover up crimes. The legal precedent established by Elias's case strengthened protections for future whistleblowers and established new standards for public interest disclosures involving government misconduct. Legal scholars argued that his successful defense would make it much more difficult for authorities to retaliate against individuals who expose official wrongdoing, particularly when that wrongdoing involves serious crimes against vulnerable victims. The psychological toll of his ordeal was significant, but Elias found strength and purpose in the knowledge that his actions had led to justice for victims who had been silenced for years. The letters and messages of support he received from around the world provided evidence that his sacrifice had inspired others to speak out against injustice and corruption in their own communities and countries. The royal family's attempts to rehabilitate their image following the scandal proved largely unsuccessful, with public trust in the monarchy remaining at historic lows even as they implemented new transparency measures and ethical guidelines. The fundamental damage to their legitimacy could not be repaired through public relations campaigns or superficial reforms, as the evidence of their willingness to abuse power and obstruct justice had been too comprehensive and damning. The academic and scholarly response to Elias's case provided important insights into the psychology of whistleblowing and the institutional factors that either encourage or discourage individuals from exposing wrongdoing. His story became a case study in ethics courses around the world, illustrating the complex moral considerations involved when loyalty to institutions conflicts with broader obligations to justice and human rights. The transformation of Elias from a loyal royal guard to an international symbol of courage and integrity reflected broader changes in public attitudes toward authority and accountability. His willingness to sacrifice his career and freedom to expose the truth resonated with people who were increasingly skeptical of official narratives and demanding greater transparency from their leaders and institutions. The ongoing impact of his revelations continued to unfold as new evidence emerged and additional investigations were launched into related areas of government misconduct and institutional corruption. Elias's decision to break his silence had opened floodgates that could not be closed, leading to a broader reckoning with abuse of power that extended far beyond the original royal scandal. As the first anniversary of his dramatic disclosure approached, Elias reflected on the journey that had transformed him from an anonymous palace guard into one of the most recognized whistleblowers in modern history. The personal costs had been enormous, but the knowledge that his courage had led to justice for victims and accountability for powerful criminals provided a sense of purpose and meaning that no amount of personal comfort or security could have matched. 2 years after Elias Morgan's life-changing decision to expose the royal family's darkest secrets, the final chapter of his extraordinary story was still being written as the full consequences of his courage continued to reshape British society and its institutions. The young man who had once stood silently at his post while powerful people committed crimes in his presence had become a catalyst for the most significant constitutional and social transformation in modern British history. The criminal trials resulting from Elias's evidence had concluded with unprecedented convictions that sent shockwaves through the establishment and demonstrated that even the most powerful individuals were not above the law. Prince Andrew had been sentenced to 18 years in prison for multiple counts of sexual assault and conspiracy to obstruct justice, becoming the first senior royal to serve time in a common prison, alongside other convicted criminals. The Queen herself had faced criminal charges for her role in the cover-up, though her advanced age and deteriorating health had resulted in a suspended sentence and her immediate abdication from the throne. The constitutional crisis triggered by her forced departure had led to the establishment of a parliamentary commission tasked with fundamentally reforming the monarchy or potentially abolishing it entirely, in favor of a republican system of government. Elias's own legal vindication had come in the form of a unanimous acquittal by a jury that deliberated for less than 2 hours before concluding that his whistleblowing had been not only legally justified but morally essential. The judge's remarks during sentencing praised Elias's courage and integrity while condemning the government's attempts to prosecute someone whose actions had served the vital public interest of exposing systematic criminal behavior. The broader impact of Elias's revelations extended far beyond the royal family to encompass sweeping reforms in government transparency, media regulation, and whistleblower protection that had transformed British democracy in fundamental ways. New laws required officials to report suspected crimes regardless of the status or position of the individuals involved, while strengthened protections for whistleblowers made it much safer for future to expose wrongdoing without fear of retaliation. The international recognition of Elias's courage had made him a global symbol of integrity and moral courage, with numerous awards and honors acknowledging his sacrifice and the positive changes that had resulted from his decision to speak truth to power. Universities around the world had established scholarships and research programs in his name, studying the conditions that enable individuals to overcome institutional pressure and expose systematic wrongdoing. Emma had married Elias in a small ceremony attended by supporters from around the world who had followed their story and been inspired by their resilience in the face of enormous challenges. Their relationship had been strengthened rather than destroyed by the ordeal they had endured together, providing a foundation of trust and mutual support that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The victims, whose voices had been silenced by the royal cover-up, had finally received justice and recognition for the suffering they had endured at the hands of Prince Andrew and the system that had protected him. Several had spoken publicly about the importance of Elias's courage in giving them hope that accountability was possible even when the most powerful people in society were involved in covering up crimes. The transformation of public attitudes toward authority and accountability had been perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Elias's revelations. British citizens had developed a much more skeptical and demanding approach to their leaders and institutions, insisting on transparency and accountability in ways that would have been unthinkable before the royal scandal exposed the extent of institutional corruption and abuse of power. The media landscape that had been permanently altered by the scandal, with new ethical standards and legal requirements ensuring that news organizations could not be co-opted or corrupted by powerful interests seeking to suppress legitimate news stories. The journalists who had participated in the cover-up had faced professional sanctions and criminal charges, while those who had courageously investigated and reported on Elias's evidence had been recognized and celebrated for their commitment to truth and accountability. The Commonwealth countries that had to remove the British monarch as their head of state following the scandal had established new forms of government that better reflected their values and aspirations as independent nations. The loss of these constitutional ties had diminished Britain's international influence but had also freed these countries to develop more authentic and democratic relationships with their former colonial ruler. Elias had used his newfound prominence to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and promoting transparency and accountability in government and corporate institutions around the world. The organization provided legal support, financial assistance, and psychological counseling to individuals who risked their careers and freedom to expose wrongdoing, ensuring that future truth-tellers would not have to face their challenges alone. The academic study of Elias's case had contributed to a better understanding of the psychological and social factors that enable individuals to overcome institutional pressure and act on their moral convictions even when facing severe personal consequences. His story had become required reading in ethics courses, leadership programs, and criminal justice curricula, providing valuable insights into the nature of moral courage and institutional reform. The personal growth that Elias had experienced through his ordeal had transformed him from a young man seeking direction and purpose into a confident leader committed to justice and human rights. The skills and perspectives he had developed through his military service and subsequent experience had prepared him for a lifetime of meaningful contribution to society and the protection of vulnerable people. The ongoing investigations triggered by Elias's initial revelations continued to uncover additional evidence of corruption and abuse of power in various British institutions, demonstrating that his decision to speak out had opened floodgates that could not be closed. Each new disclosure reinforced the importance of his original decision and provided additional validation for the sacrifices he had made to expose the truth. The legacy of Elias Morgan's courage would endure long after the specific details of the royal scandal had faded from public memory, serving as a permanent reminder that ordinary individuals possess the power to hold even the most powerful institutions accountable for their actions. His story demonstrated that moral courage could overcome institutional corruption and that truth and justice could prevail even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As Elias looked toward the future, he carried with him the knowledge that his moment of decision outside the Queen's study had not only changed his own life but had contributed to making British society more just, transparent, and accountable. The young guard who had once stood silently while crimes were committed in his presence had found his voice and used it to ensure that the powerful could no longer abuse their positions without facing consequences. The transformation of Elias Morgan from loyal royal guard to international whistleblowing hero represented the best of human nature and the potential for individual courage to create positive change. Even in the face of seemingly insurmountable institutional power, his story would continue to inspire future generations of truth-tellers who faced difficult choices between personal safety and moral obligation, proving that the right choice, while never easy, was always worth making. The shocking secret that Elias had overheard during his guard duty had ultimately led not to his destruction but to his redemption and the redemption of the society he had served with such courage and integrity. His bold response to institutional corruption